Close your eyes if you like. Let your body settle. Whatever today asked of you, let it go for now. You don't need to carry it into this hour. Tonight we're going to spend some time with one of the most extraordinary stories ever told on television. A story about a quiet man in a beige sweater who one day decided he had been invisible for long enough. A story about what happens when someone who has swallowed their own frustration for decades finally stops swallowing it. It's the kind of story that gets under your skin, not because it's loud, but because something in it is uncomfortably familiar. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, a like or a subscription means more to a small channel than you might think. It's how these stories find the people who need them. Now, breathe out. Let your shoulders drop. We're going somewhere quiet and wide and sun-bleached. We're going to New Mexico. We're going back to 2008. And we're going to meet Walter White. Vince Gilligan had spent years working on The X-Files as a writer and producer. Nearly a decade on a show he had genuinely loved. A show that had given him a real career and a real education in the craft of long-form television storytelling. By the mid-2000s, he had learned what that show had to teach him and was ready to build something entirely his own. Something that had never quite been made before, in exactly the form he imagined it. The idea he eventually arrived at was, by the standards of American network television in 2005, genuinely strange. Strange enough that it would be rejected by nearly every significant outlet before finding a home. The premise was simple to describe and almost impossible to sell to risk-averse network executives. A high school chemistry teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico, receives a terminal lung cancer diagnosis. Faced with his own death and the financial precariousness it would leave his family in, he decides to use his considerable and largely unrecognized knowledge of chemistry to manufacture and sell methamphetamine. The show would follow his transformation over time, not from good to bad in any simple moral sense, but from invisible to dangerous, from powerless to powerful, from a man who had spent decades quietly accepting his own smallness to a man who had finally decided, with nothing left to lose, to refuse that acceptance entirely. Gilligan described his concept to network executives with a phrase that has since become one of the most quoted lines in television development history. He wanted to turn Mr. Chips into Scarface. He wanted to take the most unthreatening, most benign archetype in American popular culture, the mild-mannered schoolteacher who had devoted his life to other people's children, and watch him become something that no one, including himself, had thought possible. Not quickly, not cartoonishly, not through some sudden revelation of hidden evil, but through a long and carefully observed series of choices, each one following from the last, with a kind of terrible internal logic, until the man at the end of the story was entirely unrecognizable from the man at the beginning. HBO passed on the project. Showtime passed. FX passed. The show eventually landed at AMC, a cable channel that had previously been known almost exclusively for broadcasting classic films and had only recently, with considerable uncertainty and genuine ambition, begun developing original programming. Their first original drama, Mad Men, had just premiered to critical admiration and modest viewership. They were in the business, for the moment, of taking risks on unconventional material. They said yes to Breaking Bad, and that decision changed the course of American television. Breaking Bad premiered on January 20th, 2008. The pilot episode opens with a pair of khaki trousers tumbling through the desert air, bright against a blue New Mexico sky, falling with a strange, slow grace toward the ground. Then a recreational vehicle careening down a dirt road at high speed, trailing a cloud of dust. Then a man in his underwear and a gas mask at the wheel, face set with the specific, almost peaceful expression of someone who has made an irreversible decision and is no longer interested in regretting it. It is, as opening sequences go, an extraordinarily clear statement of intent. You do not yet know whose trousers those are, or how any of this came to be, or why this particular man is driving through the desert in his underwear. But you know immediately that you are somewhere new, that the normal rules of television drama do not apply here. The man in the underwear is Walter Hartwell White, played by Bryan Cranston. And the casting of Bryan Cranston in this role is itself a story worth spending time on, because it is one of the most counterintuitive and ultimately correct pieces of casting in television history. A decision that the network resisted, that Gilligan insisted on, and that turned out to be the single most important creative choice the entire series made. Bryan Cranston was, in 2007, primarily known to American audiences for playing Hal on Malcolm in the Middle, a beloved broadly comic family sitcom in which he had spent 7 seasons being funny, warm, endearingly chaotic, and wholly non-threatening. He was a reliable and genuinely talented comic actor with a secure television career, and no particular reputation for dramatic intensity. By most conventional industry assessments, he was an unlikely candidate to anchor a serious dramatic series about drug manufacturing, and the slow, deliberate transformation of an ordinary man into something monstrous. Gilligan had worked with Cranston on a single episode of The X-Files years earlier, and had never forgotten what he had seen in that performance. He needed someone who could make an audience believe simultaneously in the character's genuine decency and in his capacity for profound darkness, not someone who looked dangerous from the beginning, which would undercut the premise entirely, but someone who could make the transition from one to the other feel earned and inevitable. Cranston, he was convinced, could do both. The network eventually agreed to let him test for the role. The test left no room for argument. Cranston plays Walter White in the first season, with an extraordinary and precise specificity. The specificity of a person who has been swallowing his own frustration for so long that it has become a physical habit, a way of holding his body and moving through the world that has accumulated over decades of invisible accommodation. You can see in every scene how much intelligence this man possesses and how little outlet it has ever found. You can see the teacher's practiced habit of performing competence and enthusiasm for people who are not quite paying attention. You can see, underneath everything, a person who has had to make himself smaller, repeatedly and for years, to fit inside the life that was actually available to him. That is where Breaking Bad truly begins. Not with the cancer diagnosis, which arrives early in the pilot, but with the texture of the life that preceded it. Walter White works a second job, pumping gas on weekends to supplement his teacher's salary. He is humiliated by his car wash employer in front of his own students. He contributed foundational work years ago to a chemistry company that became extraordinarily valuable, and he sold his share early and watched other people become wealthy from it. He has a loving wife, a son with cerebral palsy who adores him, a brother-in-law at the DEA who is loud and physically confident and professionally successful in ways that make Walter's quiet, invisible competence feel even more invisible by contrast. His life is not a catastrophe. It is something harder, in its way, a life that is entirely adequate, that no one from outside would identify as a tragedy, and that Walter experiences every single day as a slow, polite suffocation. The cancer diagnosis, arriving into this life, functions as a kind of terrible clarification. It is devastating news delivered to a man who was already, in some sense he had never been able to fully articulate even to himself, in the process of dying slowly in a different way. And what Walter does with this news, the specific direction he turns, the specific choice he makes in the first episode, the specific person he calls, reveals more about who he actually is than anything he has shown the people around him in years. He does not make peace. He does not become softer or more forgiving or more present. He gets angry. He gets very precisely, very deliberately angry at the waste of it, at the decades of smallness, at a world that permitted someone with his capabilities and his knowledge to arrive at this particular destination. And he decides, with the cold clarity of someone who has stopped calculating consequences because the worst one has already arrived, to do something about it. To understand why Breaking Bad resonated as deeply and as widely as it did, you have to understand the specific historical moment it arrived in. The show premiered in January 2008, and within months of its first season, the financial crisis that had been building for years began to break visibly and catastrophically into public view. Banks were failing. The housing market was collapsing. The retirement savings and home equity that millions of ordinary Americans had spent decades accumulating were disappearing with a speed that felt surreal, and the slowly emerging picture of what had caused all of it, the specific combination of institutional greed, regulatory failure, and systemic dishonesty at the center of the collapse, was generating a level of anger and disillusionment in the American public that had not been seen in generations. Walter White, in this context, is not an anomaly. He is an extreme and theatrical version of something that millions of people were feeling in quieter and less dramatic ways. He is a man who played by the rules, who studied what he was supposed to study, worked where he was supposed to work, lived how he was supposed to live, deferred gratification for decades in the belief that the system would eventually reward his compliance, and who arrived at the end of that process with a terminal illness and the quiet, bitter understanding that the social contract he had trusted had not held up its end of the bargain. The system that was supposed to take care of the people who played by its rules had turned out to be far more interested in the people who didn't. The show is set in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and this is a deliberate and meaningful choice. New Mexico is not the America that appears most often on American television. It is not New York or Los Angeles, not the coasts where ambition is plausibly rewarded and economic mobility is at least theoretically available, and the machinery of opportunity functions with some recognizable consistency. It is the interior of the country, the flat and sun-bleached middle, where poverty rates are high and healthcare is inadequate, and the distance between what people were told the American dream looked like and what their actual daily lives consist of is very large and very visible. Walter White is a man from that America. Not the exciting America, not the aspirational America, not the America where intelligence and hard work reliably produce recognition and reward. The other one. The healthcare dimension of Walter's situation is worth dwelling on, because the show handles it with an unusual political specificity that has only become more resonant in the years since. Walter has insurance, but it is inadequate to cover the full cost of the treatment that might save his life. His wealthy former business partner, the man who became a multimillionaire partly through early work that Walter contributed to, offers to pay for everything. Walter's brother-in-law offers to help arrange better care through his connections. Walter refuses both, and this refusal is the first fully diagnostic moment in the series. The moment that reveals, more clearly than anything that comes before it, who Walter actually is underneath the performance of quiet acceptance. He cannot accept help from the people who profited from his contributions and then left him behind. He would rather manufacture illegal narcotics than be in their debt. That preference is not simply about pride. It is about something more specifically American and more specifically injured than pride. The show is also, in ways that became increasingly explicit across its run, a story about a particular version of masculinity under a particular kind of stress. The provider who cannot provide adequately, the expert whose expertise goes unrecognized, the man who is given a very specific story about what his value and his worth consisted of, the ability to earn, to support, to be the competent and irreplaceable center of his family's material existence, and who finds himself unable to inhabit that story through legitimate means. Walter's turn to methamphetamine manufacturing is, on one level, a pragmatic response to financial desperation and terminal illness. On another level, it is a response to something older and deeper and more pervasive, the feeling of having been, for years, and possibly for his entire adult life, less than what he believed he deserved to be. This is not a defense of what Walter does. The show is not a defense of what Walter does, and it becomes progressively less sympathetic to him as his choices become harder to rationalize. But it asks you, it insists in the early seasons, that you understand the specific shape of the injury that preceded those choices, that you feel the weight of the frustration before you watch what the frustration produces. And understanding it requires being honest about the stories that American culture has told its men about what they are for, and what happens when those stories encounter the reality of actual lives that cannot fulfill them. Jesse Pinkman enters the series as Walter's former student, a small-time methamphetamine dealer and user who Walter recognizes during a DEA ride-along and approaches as a potential business partner. Jesse is, in the early episodes, mostly comic relief, foul-mouthed, chaotic, perpetually surprised by circumstances, completely unprepared for the person Walter is in the process of becoming. He talks in a specific idiom that Gilligan and the writers developed with great care, intensely contemporary, full of verbal tics and enthusiasms, and a particular kind of street-level bravado that exists in almost direct proportion to his actual vulnerability. He is, at first glance, someone you might not take entirely seriously. The show has plans for Jesse that extend very far beyond comic relief, and the revelation of those plans is one of the great pleasures of watching Breaking Bad for the first time. Jesse Pinkman is, it turns out, the moral center of the series. Not because he is good, exactly. He makes terrible choices throughout, and his relationship to his own conscience is complicated and often painful, but because he is the character who feels things fully and consistently, and cannot stop feeling them, who registers the human cost of what they are doing in ways that accumulate visibly across his face and his body, who is constitutionally incapable of the emotional insulation that Walter constructs with such deliberate care across the series. Jesse sees the people they are selling to. He sees what happens to them. He sees the people who get hurt around them in consequence of things he and Walter have done, and he cannot stop seeing them, in the way that Walter has learned, with increasing expertise, to simply look away. Aaron Paul's performance as Jesse is one of the greatest in the series, and one of the most technically demanding, because the character requires him to simultaneously be funny and heartbreaking, stupid and perceptive, weak and genuinely brave, sometimes within the same scene. He carries enormous amounts of the show's emotional weight while appearing not to be doing very much at all, a kind of performed casualness that masks extraordinary technical work. The Emmy he won for the role in 2010 was one of the more unambiguously correct decisions the Television Academy has made in recent memory. The relationship between Walter and Jesse is the emotional spine of the series, and it is one of the most carefully and honestly observed relationships in television history. It cannot be reduced to a simple description: mentor and student, exploiter and exploited, father and son, because it contains elements of all of these things and more. It is a compulsive connection between two people who need each other in ways that neither fully understands and neither would choose if they were thinking clearly about their own interests, and who are drawn together and damaged by each other across 5 seasons, with a consistency that gives the show its deepest emotional resonance. Walter needs Jesse practically. Jesse provides the market knowledge and the human connections and the street-level intelligence that Walter's purely technical brilliance cannot generate on its own. But Walter also needs Jesse in a deeper way that the show makes visible slowly and without announcement. Jesse is the person in whose presence Walter's prodigious ego can expand without limit or resistance. Jesse's genuine admiration for Walter's chemistry, his dependence on Walter's intelligence, his fundamental inability to compete with Walter in the domains where Walter most needs to feel superior, all of this feeds something in Walter that his legitimate life had been starving for decades. Walter around Jesse is Walter at his most expansive and his most dangerous, because he is Walter freed from the obligation to be modest. Jesse needs Walter's competence, and Jesse needs Walter's protection in a world that would have killed him alone. But Jesse also needs something from Walter that the show is careful not to state explicitly, and does not need to state explicitly. Jesse is looking for the version of a father figure that his actual father never was. Someone who sees his intelligence and his capacity, even while exploiting both. Someone who, in certain moments, makes him feel like he matters, and who, in other moments, treats him as a problem to be solved. This alternation, the warmth and the use cycling against each other, is the source of both the genuine care in their relationship and its most lasting damage. Gustavo Fring enters the series in the 2nd season, and immediately changes the weight and scale of the story. He is introduced as the owner of a regional fast food chain, Los Polos Hermanos, a small empire of cheerful yellow and white restaurants serving rotisserie chicken across the Southwest. He is a civic-minded businessman who donates to law enforcement foundations and appears at community events and maintains the kind of meticulous, courteous exterior that makes him invisible to exactly the people whose job it is to be suspicious of him. He is also, as Walter and Jesse eventually discover, one of the most sophisticated and disciplined drug distributors in the American Southwest, a man who has built an operation of extraordinary scale and precision behind the absolute cover of his perfectly constructed respectability. Fring is, in many respects, the fully realized version of what Walter is aspiring to become. A man of absolute control, absolute discipline, absolute concealment, who has achieved everything Walter wants: power, money, security, the ability to operate without being seen, and who has achieved it through decades of patient and systematic work that makes Walter's ambitions look, by comparison, like the impulsive dreams of someone who only recently decided to want something. The contrast between them is one of the show's great structural pleasures. Walter wants power, because it fills the specific shape of the wound left by decades of invisibility. Fring pursues his objectives for reasons that are, at least in part, entirely different, reasons that the companion series Better Call Saul would eventually reveal with remarkable precision. Better Call Saul ran from 2015 to 2022 and is, by any serious critical assessment, the full equal of the show that generated it, which is an extraordinary thing to be able to say about a television spin-off, a form that has historically been more likely to diminish its source material than to match or exceed it. The story of Jimmy McGill's transformation into Saul Goodman is told with a patience and an emotional intelligence and a genuine love for its characters that matches everything Breaking Bad achieved, and the additional dimension it provides to Fring, showing us who he was before Albuquerque, what happened to him in Chile, and what it cost him, transforms him from an extraordinary antagonist into something more complete and more genuinely tragic. A man who organized his entire existence around a wound that could never be healed, who achieved everything he set out to achieve, and for whom achievement and satisfaction remained permanently and entirely separate things. Giancarlo Esposito's performance as Fring across both series is one of the landmarks of contemporary American television acting. He plays the character with an almost supernatural stillness, a quality of presence that conveys enormous internal pressure and complexity through the absolute control of its external surface. Like certain other iconic television and film performances, he communicates volumes without raising his voice, without dramatic gesture, through the precision of his movements and the specific quality of his attention. He is the kind of character who becomes iconic, not through memorable speeches or confrontational moments, but through the persistent, unsettling feeling that something vast and purposeful and entirely cold is operating just beneath the surface of his perfect, practiced courtesy. Breaking Bad changed American television in ways that are real and lasting and worth examining with some specificity. The most fundamental change was the demonstration, as complete and persuasive a demonstration as the medium has ever provided, that a long-form dramatic series could be conceived from the beginning as a finite story with a planned ending, executed with structural precision across multiple seasons, and delivered as a complete and satisfying narrative whole, the way a great novel is complete and satisfying, rather than the way a network series traditionally extended itself for as long as audience interest and advertiser money could sustain it. Before Breaking Bad, the dominant model for prestige cable drama was still essentially open-ended. Great shows had ended. Some well, some less so, but their endings had often felt either arbitrary or deliberately unresolved. Breaking Bad demonstrated, definitively, that planning mattered. That knowing where you were going allowed you to lay groundwork in Season 1 that would pay off in Season 5 in ways that felt not like clever plotting but like inevitability. Audiences who had been disappointed too many times by serialized television that lost the thread, or compromised its vision, or simply ran out of story while continuing to produce episodes discovered that this particular show had known where it was going all along. And the ending it delivered, genuinely earned, genuinely complete, genuinely satisfying in the specific way that only years of patient storytelling can produce, reset the expectations of what dramatic television was supposed to be able to do. The show also pushed further than anything before it on the question of how morally compromised a protagonist could be and still command an audience's sustained engagement. The anti-hero had existed in television before Walter White. Tony Soprano had been, in many ways, the template. But Tony Soprano operated within a genre context that provided distance. The mob movie, the gangster narrative, a world of violence and criminality that audiences could engage with without feeling implicated in the same direct way. Walter White had no such distance. He was a chemistry teacher. He was a father. He was someone you might have gone to school with, or taught your children, or lived next door to. And the show made you understand him, root for him, and then very deliberately showed you what you had been rooting for. That movement, from sympathy to complicity to horror, executed over 5 seasons with absolute control, is the show's central formal achievement and its most lasting contribution to the form. It proved that audiences were more sophisticated and more willing to be challenged than the industry had generally assumed, that they could hold moral complexity across years of engagement without needing it to resolve into simple judgment, that they could be made genuinely uncomfortable by their own responses to a narrative and would not simply switch off when that discomfort arrived. This understanding of what audiences were capable of has shaped prestige television ever since. Breaking Bad also became, in the years following its conclusion in 2013, a different kind of cultural phenomenon, one that extended far beyond the audience that had watched it and into the broader internet consciousness in ways that are difficult to predict and impossible to engineer. It became meme culture. It became the source of a vocabulary and a set of images and a shorthand that have migrated completely beyond the show's original context. The lines have taken on a life that their dramatic context no longer constrains. I am the danger. I am the one who knocks. Say my name. These are not quotes that require familiarity with Breaking Bad to function as communication. They have become part of a shared language for describing a particular kind of self-assertion, for the moment when someone who has been underestimated finally, visibly refuses to be underestimated anymore. They are deployed in contexts that have nothing to do with meth or cancer or the New Mexico desert, because what they express is recognizable and useful in contexts far removed from those things. This kind of cultural saturation, the migration of specific phrases and images from a specific work into the general language, is rare and tells you something important about what a work touched that went deeper than its explicit subject matter. Breaking Bad touched something about the desire to be seen, to be feared, to finally matter, that resonated with an enormous number of people who had no personal connection to drug manufacturing or organized crime and never would, because it was not really about the meth. The meth was the vehicle, what the show was actually about, the hunger for recognition, the injury of invisible competence. The specific American experience of capability without outlet was something much more common and much more quietly pervasive. The show also generated, in Better Call Saul, one of the most remarkable pieces of companion television in the history of the medium. Better Call Saul is not a lesser version of Breaking Bad. It is a different kind of story told with equal skill, slower in its pacing, more intimate in its focus, more genuinely sympathetic to its central character, in ways that ultimately make his transformation more heartbreaking rather than less. Jimmy McGill, who becomes Saul Goodman, is one of the great characters in contemporary television, and the 6 seasons of his story constitute an achievement that stands entirely on its own terms, even while enriching and deepening the world of its parent show. What makes Breaking Bad last, what will make it still matter in another decade and in the decade after that, is not its darkness, though the darkness is real and important and not sentimentalized. It is the absolute rigor of its moral vision. The show believes, without equivocation and without escape hatches, that choices matter, that people are genuinely responsible for the consequences of their decisions, even when those decisions were made under real pressure and in response to real grievances. It refuses every available way out. It declines, steadily and season after season, to let Walter escape through circumstance or sympathy or the argument that the system made him do it. The system was unjust. The cancer was real. The frustrations were legitimate, and none of that changes what he chose to do, or what those choices cost, or who he became in the process of making them. The final episode, Felina, is one of the most rigorously satisfying series finales in the history of American television drama. Not because it is happy, not because Walter is redeemed in any conventional sense of the word. What it is earned. The ending follows from everything that preceded it with the same internal logic the show applied throughout its run. Walter achieves some of what he set out to achieve in the final hours, fails at other things, and dies in the place where he was always most completely himself, in the laboratory, surrounded by his work. Whether this constitutes a tragedy or a dark and qualified satisfaction depends entirely on who you are when you watch it, and what you have decided, across the preceding 5 seasons, about who Walter White actually was. Walter White has been dead, in the world of the show, since 2013. He is more present in the culture than most fictional characters from that period or any period. His story is still discussed, still argued about, still used as a reference point for conversations about ambition and pride, and the specific cost of refusing to accept the smallness of your own life. Not because he was admirable, not because his choices were defensible, but because the hungers that drove him, stripped of their extreme and theatrical consequences, are recognizable hungers. Because the gap between what he believed he deserved and what his life had actually given him is a gap that a very large number of people have felt, in quieter and less catastrophic ways, without being able to close it. That is what great fiction does at its best. It takes something that is diffuse and unspoken and only half understood, and it gives it a shape precise enough to be seen clearly. Breaking Bad gave a generation a language for thinking about ambition and failure and the specific injury of capability without recognition, of intelligence without outlet, of a life that seemed like it should have been more than it turned out to be. That language has not stopped being useful. That mirror has not been put away. That is all for tonight. I hope this gave you something worth sitting with. The story of a man who got everything he wanted and lost everything that mattered, told by a series that had the honesty and the craft to show you both of those things clearly, at the same time, without telling you how to feel about any of it. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. A like, a comment, a subscription, all of it means more than you might think for a small channel like this one. It is how these stories find the people they are meant to find. Sleep well. Take care of yourself. I will see you in the next one. The world of Breaking Bad is built with unusual geographic and social specificity, and that specificity is part of what makes it feel real in a way that elevates it above the standard crime drama. Albuquerque is not a glamorous setting. It does not carry the mythological weight of New York or the sun-drenched ambition of Los Angeles. It is a mid-sized southwestern city with a complex history, a substantial poor population, beautiful desert landscapes, and the particular atmosphere of a place that has been promised things it did not receive. The show uses this setting with care and purpose. The vast, empty spaces of the desert function as both a practical location for illegal activity and a visual metaphor for the kind of exposure that Walter is simultaneously seeking and fleeing. There is nowhere to hide in the desert, and there is something that Walter craves about that, even as he is terrified by it. The chemistry is also handled with unusual seriousness. The show consulted with actual chemists and with the DEA during its production, and while the precise synthesis of Walter's product is never fully detailed on screen, a responsible decision, given the real-world application, the general principles and the language and the culture of chemistry are rendered accurately enough that scientists who watched the show generally found it credible. Walter's pride in his product is one of the most revealing things about him. The blue color of the methamphetamine he manufactures is not just a brand identifier. It is an expression of craft, of the same attention to precision and purity that would have made him a great scientist in a different life and a different set of circumstances. He is doing the same thing in the desert that he did in the classroom, with the same standards and the same exacting care. The context has changed completely. The man has not. Skyler White is a character who generated an extraordinary amount of antagonism from a portion of Breaking Bad's audience, and the reasons for that antagonism are themselves revealing and worth examining. Skyler is Walter's wife, intelligent, capable, morally serious in ways that Walter has long since ceased to be, and progressively more aware that something has gone deeply wrong in her marriage and in her household. She is the obstacle, for significant portions of the show's run, to Walter doing exactly what he wants to do. She asks questions. She refuses to simply accept the explanations she is given. She exercises judgment and eventually makes choices of her own, some of which are questionable and some of which are entirely reasonable given what she knows. The vocal and sometimes vicious online response to Skyler, a response that Anna Gunn, who played her, has written about publicly and at some length, is essentially the response of people who had so thoroughly identified with Walter White that his obstacles felt like their own obstacles, and his adversaries felt like adversaries to be resented, which is exactly what the show intended. The discomfort that the audience's response to Skyler should produce is a data point about what the show had achieved. It had made people root for someone they should not have been rooting for. Hard enough that when the person most clearly representing a sane and moral perspective pushed back against him, they resented her for it. Gilligan has said that this was, at least in part, intentional. He wanted you to catch yourself in the act of taking Walter's side. He wanted the moment of recognition to be uncomfortable. Walter's family, Skyler, his son Walter Jr., his brother-in-law Hank, his sister-in-law Marie, function in the show as the real-world consequences of his choices made visible. They are the people who love him, who need him, who are damaged by what he becomes, who are caught in consequences they did not choose and cannot fully comprehend. Hank Schrader, played by Dean Norris, is particularly significant. He is the loud, self-congratulatory, physically confident man that Walter is not, and their dynamic across the series captures with uncomfortable accuracy the specific texture of a certain kind of masculine inadequacy. The way Walter's resentment of Hank's ease and visibility is one of the small, persistent wounds that shapes who he becomes. The show's visual grammar is extraordinary and deserves mention, because Breaking Bad is one of the most carefully composed series in television history. The cinematography, much of it by Michael Slovis, makes extraordinary use of the New Mexico landscape, the harsh desert light, the wide open spaces that simultaneously dwarf the characters and expose them. The color palette shifts across the series as Walter's transformation progresses, moving from the faded, slightly washed-out tones of his early suburban life toward the deeper, more saturated colors of the criminal world he enters. The low-angle shots that Gilligan favored for certain key scenes, the camera positioned below floor level, looking up at characters from an unusual perspective, create a disorienting quality that suggests an altered relationship to normality, a world in which the usual laws do not quite apply. Time-lapse sequences are used throughout the series to compress duration and suggest the passage of time in ways that carry emotional weight. The dissolve of Walter's hair during chemotherapy, the slow accumulation of money in a storage unit, the gradual construction of an underground laboratory beneath a laundromat. These sequences are not merely expository. They are meditative, almost hypnotic, and they give the show a quality of scale and duration that reinforces its central argument about how transformation happens, not through sudden revelation but through the slow accumulation of choices, each one small, each one following from the last. The music of Breaking Bad is another element that rewards attention. Dave Porter's score is electronic and often dissonant, full of textures that suggest industrial process and chemical transformation, appropriate for a show about a chemist. The licensed music choices are consistently interesting and sometimes startling. The decision to use a specific piece of music at a specific moment is always deliberate and always carries meaning. The show is also notable for the quality and placement of its needle drops, the moments when existing recordings are used in scenes with a precision that suggests genuine musical intelligence behind the selection. Walt's transformation into Heisenberg is tracked not just through his choices but through his physical presentation, which changes significantly across the 5 seasons. The khaki trousers and the pastel teacher's shirts of the first season give way, gradually, to darker clothing, a shaved head, a pork pie hat that becomes one of the most recognizable props in contemporary television. These are not accidental changes. They are Walter's deliberate construction of an identity, his visible effort to become the person he believes he was always meant to be. The hat in particular carries enormous symbolic weight. It is both a disguise and a declaration, a way of marking the boundary between Walter White, the chemistry teacher, and Heisenberg, the drug lord, and of choosing, every time it is put on, which one to be in that moment. The penultimate episode, Ozymandias, named for the Shelley sonnet about a fallen king whose empire has crumbled to nothing, is widely considered one of the finest single episodes of television ever made. It is the episode in which everything collapses simultaneously, in which the consequences of 5 seasons of choices arrive all at once, with a force and a finality that is almost difficult to watch. Gilligan has described it as the episode he was most proud of in the series, and it is not difficult to understand why. It achieves the near impossible feat of making every terrible thing that happens feel both shocking and inevitable, because the show has laid the groundwork for all of it with such care and over such a long time. The performance Bryan Cranston gives in this episode is extraordinary, even by the standards of his extraordinary work throughout the series. The reception of Breaking Bad's finale was notably different from the reception of the finales of other great serialized dramas that preceded it. The Sopranos' ending, the cut to black, the deliberate refusal of resolution, had divided audiences and critics profoundly and is still argued about. The Lost finale had disappointed a substantial portion of its devoted audience, who felt that the show's accumulation of mysteries had promised answers that were not delivered. Breaking Bad's finale satisfied its audience in a way that neither of those endings had quite managed, and the reasons for this satisfaction are instructive. The show had spent 5 seasons earning its ending. It had not promised things it could not deliver. It had not accumulated mysteries for their own sake. It had told a story about a specific person making specific choices with specific consequences, and it delivered the consequences of those choices with complete integrity. The concept of the anti-hero protagonist existed before Walter White, and Breaking Bad was not naive about its debt to what came before. The Sopranos had demonstrated that a violent and morally reprehensible man could be the center of a prestige drama. The Shield had followed a corrupt police officer with genuine sympathy and intelligence. Dexter had made a serial killer its protagonist, though it pulled its punches in ways that ultimately limited what the show could say. What Breaking Bad did differently was refuse the safety net that all of these predecessors had provided: the genre distance of the mob story, the institutional context of the police procedural, the fantasy framing of the serial killer genre. Walter White was a real person in a recognizable world making recognizable choices, and the show offered no comfortable fiction to absorb the full weight of what he was doing. The influence of Breaking Bad on the television that followed it is visible everywhere in contemporary drama. The willingness to let protagonists be genuinely wrong, to follow characters through sustained moral deterioration without softening the landing, to trust audiences with endings that are earned rather than consoling. All of these qualities became standard aspirations, if not always achievements, in the prestige drama that followed. Shows that might not have been made, or might have been made differently, in a pre-Breaking Bad landscape include a substantial portion of the best television of the last decade. The template has been widely imitated and rarely equaled, but the fact that so many writers and showrunners have tried is itself a form of tribute. Walter White's final scene has been analyzed and written about extensively, and it rewards analysis. He dies alone in the meth lab, the place that was always, in some important sense, his true home, more than the suburban house, or the marriage, or the teaching career. He runs his hand along the steel surfaces of the equipment with an expression that can be read as satisfaction, or as grief, or as something that resists both of those words. The police are coming. He has minutes at most, and he spends them doing what he always found most meaningful: being present in the place where his intelligence was most completely expressed. Whether that is a tragedy or a dark kind of peace is left entirely to the viewer to determine, and different viewers have determined it very differently, which is precisely as Gilligan intended. The parallel between Walter's death and the way people think about their own professional identities, the question of where, exactly, you are most fully yourself, and what it costs to be somewhere else most of the time, is one of the show's quieter observations, easy to miss in the drama of the final season, but available if you are looking for it. Walter White was most alive in the lab, most completely present, most completely engaged, most completely himself. The tragedy of his story is not simply that he made terrible choices. It is that the choices were in some ways a response to having been, for most of his adult life, required to be himself somewhere else, in a classroom, in a car wash, in a domestic life that was real and genuinely loved, but that could not contain the full extent of what he was. The show's treatment of pride is consistent and important and worth naming explicitly. Walter White's fatal flaw, the quality that the show identifies most clearly as the engine of his destruction, is not ambition exactly, or greed exactly, or even violence exactly. It is pride. Specifically, it is the refusal to let anyone else define him, the refusal to accept less than what he believed himself capable of, the refusal to be invisible, even when visibility required destroying everything around him. He says, in the final episode, that he did it for himself, that he liked it, that he was good at it, and it made him feel alive. This is the most honest thing he says in the entire series, and it arrives too late to save anything. But it arrives. And the show requires him to say it, because the show has always been committed to making him own what he actually is, rather than the stories he told himself about why he was doing it. The legacy of Breaking Bad is also a legacy of craft, of the demonstration that television can be made with the same level of intentionality and precision that the best literary fiction aspires to. Every decision in the show was a decision. The placement of a camera, the color of a costume, the choice of a piece of music, the specific word used in a specific line of dialogue. This level of intentionality is not common in any storytelling medium, and is especially not common in television, which has historically produced enormous quantities of content under time and budget pressures that militate against the kind of careful consideration that Breaking Bad consistently demonstrated. The show is a useful argument, in an era when the quantity of content is often prioritized over its quality, for what quality actually looks like when it is taken seriously. Bryan Cranston has spoken in interviews about the experience of playing Walter White across 5 seasons and about what it cost him personally to inhabit the character for the extended periods that television production requires. He describes having to find and access aspects of himself that he would not otherwise have wanted to spend time with. The resentment, the pride, the willingness to hurt people in the service of his own objectives, and then having to set them aside at the end of each day, or at least to try. The performance he gave is inseparable from this personal commitment to finding the truth of the character rather than performing its outward signs, and the result is one of the great acting achievements in the history of the medium. A man who is comprehensible and frightening and recognizable and monstrous all at once, across 62 episodes, without losing coherence or honesty for a single scene. The question of whether Walter White is sympathetic is one that people who have watched Breaking Bad have been arguing about since the show's first season, and the fact that the argument has never been resolved, that it cannot be resolved, is the clearest evidence of the show's success as a moral drama. Sympathy is not the same thing as endorsement. You can understand a person fully, can feel the weight of their frustration, can see the logic of their choices, can track the accumulated grievances that shape them, and still judge those choices as wrong and those consequences as deserved. Breaking Bad creates the conditions for both responses simultaneously and holds them in tension without resolving either. That is not a comfortable experience. It was not designed to be. The DEA storyline, anchored by Hank Schrader's years-long pursuit of the drug manufacturer known as Heisenberg, is one of the great dramatic ironies in contemporary television. Hank is looking for a monster, and the monster is sitting across from him at the dinner table. The show uses this irony with remarkable restraint. It is not played for comedy, or for the kind of clever winking at the audience that would undercut its weight. Instead, it is played as dramatic tension, as the show's way of making visible just how thoroughly Walter has transformed, how far he has traveled from the man Hank thinks he knows into something that the man Hank thinks he knows could not have imagined. The moment of revelation, when it finally comes, is one of the most carefully prepared and devastating payoffs in the series. The episode 51, the episode of Walter's 51st birthday, which opens with a brief, terrible montage of his 49th and 50th birthdays by comparison, is a masterclass in compressed storytelling and in the use of the ordinary to contain the extraordinary. Skylar walks fully clothed into a swimming pool in front of their guests, not as a dramatic gesture, but as the only move available to her, a way of creating a situation that requires her children to leave without her having to explain why she needs them gone. It is one of the show's most precise observations about how people in impossible situations operate, not through the dramatic confrontations of conventional storytelling, but through the imperfect, pragmatic, sometimes absurd maneuvers that real crisis produces. The show's fifth season split into two halves, the first airing in 2012 and the second in 2013, is where Breaking Bad moves fully from drama into something closer to Greek tragedy. The inevitability of the ending becomes visible early in the final half season, and Gilligan and his writers do something remarkable with that visibility. They use it. They allow you to see the ending coming, to watch Walter move toward his destruction with a combination of intention and blindness, to feel the specific horror of watching someone who cannot stop even when stopping is clearly the only reasonable option. The show earns this tragic structure because it has spent 4.5 seasons making you understand, in granular detail, why Walter cannot stop. The compulsion is legible. The blindness is comprehensible. The destruction, when it arrives, feels both surprising and entirely inevitable. Breaking Bad is also, in ways that are easy to overlook given the scale of its dramatic events, a love story, or rather, a story about the destruction of love. Walter and Skyler's marriage is, at the beginning of the series, genuinely loving, imperfect, a little taken for granted on both sides, but real. The show tracks its disintegration with the same slow precision it applies to Walter's moral transformation, because the disintegration of the marriage is part of the same process. Each lie told to Skyler, each manipulation of her trust, each time Walter chooses his operation over his family, is a stone removed from the foundation of something that could not be rebuilt once enough stones were gone. By the final season, what was a marriage has become a negotiation between two people who are too compromised in different ways to easily separate, but who can no longer be in the same room without the full weight of what has happened between them being present. The show asks implicitly what Walter loved, what he actually valued, at the level of revealed preference rather than stated preference. He says throughout the series that he is doing everything for his family, that the money, the risk, the violence, all of it is for Skyler and Walt Jr. and the baby Holly. The show dismantles this claim methodically, not through argument but through action, by showing you, again and again, the moments when Walter had the choice between his family and Heisenberg, and chose Heisenberg. What Walter loved, in the end, was the thing his family could not give him and his legitimate life had never given him. The feeling of being completely, undeniably, irreversibly himself. The feeling of mattering. The lab gave him that. Nothing else did. And the show, in its final episode, gives him back the lab and nothing else, and lets you decide how to feel about that. The silence at the end of Breaking Bad, the quiet after the last shot, before the credits, is one of the most considered silences in television history. There is nothing left to explain. The story has been told. The choices have been made and the consequences have arrived, and the man at the center of it all is gone. What remains is the question the show has been asking all along, delivered now without any more story to carry it. Not what did Walter White deserve, but what did you feel watching him get it? What did his hungers reveal about yours? What did his story illuminate about the space between who you are and who you believed you were supposed to be? That is the question Breaking Bad leaves you with. That is the question it was always asking. And it is by design a question that does not resolve.